Welcome everybody. It's my pleasure to join you. Firstly, Hepburn Shire acknowledges the Dja Dja Wurrung as the traditional owners of the lands and waters on which we live and work. On these lands, Dja have performed age-old ceremonies of celebration, initiation and renewal. We recognise their resilience through dispossession, and it is a testament to their continuing culture and tradition, which is strong and thriving. We also acknowledge the neighbouring traditional owners, the Wurundjeri to our southeast and the Wadawurrung to our southwest, and pay our respects to all Aboriginal peoples, their culture and law. We acknowledge their living culture and the unique role they play in the life of this region. Well, welcome everybody. I'm Ron Torres, the Executive Manager of Development and Community Safety, and I'm joined by my colleague Bronwyn Southee, our Manager of Strategic Planning. Bronwyn and I will take you through the upcoming Council agenda on September 3. The purpose of this recorded session is to take you through the agenda items, explain the documents, and run through the basis behind the officer recommendations. So the special council meeting agenda will consist of a number of reports. Firstly, there will be a covering report, which will provide the context for our Future Hepburn program. Attached to this will be a very comprehensive engagement report, which will detail the process we undertook under this program, and more importantly, the findings. And those findings will have informed the high-level key themes that are elaborated on in the covering report. The key themes and issues really came from our very extensive community engagement and consultation process, and I do thank you all for the almost 600 submissions we've received, on top of the public meetings we've had, the phone calls the team has received, and the one-on-one meetings that we spent a lot of time conducting. So thank you very much to our Hepburn community, our stakeholders, and also the public agencies that have contributed to this amazing program. So September 3 represents the culmination of an important stage in the Future Hepburn program. There are many more to come, but this has been by far the most significant stage in this process. So first up, the covering report will contain an officer's recommendation. This recommendation will really cover procedural matters, administrative matters, but there are two particular recommendations that we will bring to your attention. Further on in this recording, we will talk about each individual township report and also talk about the rural strategy and its recommendations. So to take you through the covering report, particular recommendations of note, I'll invite Bronwyn to speak to those. Thank you, Bronwyn.
Thank you, Ron. And I absolutely mirror your comments around thanking the community and various stakeholders for their involvement. It has been a really engaged and dynamic process. So thank you very much to all. I think first and foremost, just before we jump into those specific recommendations of interest, it's just really important as well that I reiterate what we're presenting to the community and to council. So it will be the 6 structure plan reports, which includes the rural strategy and 5 township strategies, being Clunes, Creswick, Daylesford and Hepburn Springs, Glenlyon and Trentham. As part of this, as Ron has just touched on, as part of this recommendation, the first is an overarching recommendation to have these structure plans and rural strategies adopted by council to then go through a separate process following this, which we'll go into a bit later. What we would really like to bring to your attention is some of those critical recommendations that we've identified. The as part of the structure planning work, we had a number of technical studies that were undertaken to support this work, and one of which was cultural values assessments undertaken by the traditional owners, being the Jara people, and their consultants, Jandak, who supplied us with some really valuable information, which, to ensure that we are able to embody and respect that work, we have two key recommendations. The first is we will write to the Minister for Planning, calling on the Minister to protect one of Jara and Hepburn Shire's most valued landscape features by approving an interim landscape overlay over Lalgumbook, also known as Mount Franklin, and surrounding features as mapped in attachment 2. This will ensure that the area is protected whilst officers prepare a planning scheme amendment to implement permanent controls. So what this means is we need to ensure that the site is not completely developed over. We don't currently have controls in place that sufficiently protected. And so one of those critical recommendations in response to an urgency raised by both councillors and the community is that this is protected immediately. As a follow through, we also note that officers will continue to collaborate with the Jara people in the next phase of future Hepburn work. This will include preparing an implementation plan. Officers will seek to incorporate an action to undertake a Shire-wide strategic landscape assessment that assesses land use, cultural, biodiversity factors, and aesthetic influences to inform land use development and landscape protection measures. This will allow Council to integrate a full range of influences alongside culture in planning for the Shire's approach to landscape.
Thank you, Bron. And those two recommendations really form part of a bigger picture of the important collaboration Council has achieved with Jara on the future Hepburn program. So you will find other references to that important work throughout the reports we'll be going through. So we will have 6 reports to run you through. The first one being Rural Hepburn. So we'll run through that. Following that, we'll run through the individual township structure plans. So our Rural Hepburn Agricultural Land Study and Rural Settlement Strategy is, in effect, our overarching strategy that underpins our 5 township structure plans. Bron, could you please take us through the rural strategy and its importance?
Thanks, Ron. Yeah, absolutely. It is I would debate, the most important of all the strategies, as it's our primary feeder as to a settlement, how we are planning for housing and growth. One of the interesting facts that came through some of the work was that 40% of all houses approved since 2011 has been in our agricultural land. And the result of that has been fragmenting quality agricultural land. So we've really got to focus on how we improve that. And that came through really strongly in our community consultation as well. What I'll do is I'll just share my screen and we'll have a look at some of the plans that we are working on. Now, are you able to see the full screen of the draft officer recommendation, Ron?
Bron, you'll need to change the viewing mode because I can see
everything.
Sort of everything.
Okay, my apologies.
So if everyone could please bear with us, we'll overcome technology, and that's perfect, Bron. So
brilliant.
There you go.
Brilliant. So in effect, the draft rural strategy came in 2 parts. We had the background report that went out to the community, and that really looked at the context of which 67% of the Shire is agricultural or rural land. The rest is in our townships. What we want to protect and what we really value, that broadacre and fragmented even agricultural land, is of value. The key changes since the document that went out, which is this plan here, that went out to the public, that we're recommending in response to submissions from the authorities, from the community, and some further technical analysis, is the change around the Hepburn Newstead Road. So if you have a look at this plan and you'll see there's two main areas. You've got the yellow area, which is our primary agricultural area. That's policy area 1. That's the engine area, as we've referred to it in the strategy. This land is our really high quality, larger parcels of really strong agricultural land. We have 4 main considerations when determining what makes great quality ag land. 1 is the soil types. 2 is the climate, so whether we get decent rainfall or how the weather is responsive in that space. 3 is the fragmentation, and 4 is the infrastructure to support it, so whether they've got water. So in that yellow area, it's determined to be of the highest quality agriculture. We've then got the pinkish red area. Now that area is determined to be a little bit more fragmented. When we say fragmented, we mean the lot sizes might be a bit smaller, still could have beautiful quality soil, still could have access to infrastructure, but it's identified in policy area 2 because there is a little bit more diversity. Both areas, the primary response needs to be agriculture. However, in the red area, there is some consideration for some other diversity to support in an ancillary way that primary agricultural function. So following the submissions, you will see here there has been a slight change. We've identified that areas such as Yandoit and through Franklin Ford, some of those areas may not be appropriate for policy area 2. They're still quite heavily farmed. They have some really crucial farming networks within there, and rather than focusing on diversity, we're considering it might be best to focus on a pure approach to agricultural response. Where that has varied a little bit is down the bottom right-hand corner. We actually, above Trentham, in an area called Spring Hill. Some of the submissions and some of the considerations that came to hand were around that area already being used in smaller parcels. There's some localised vegetation and some smaller type artisan ag uses and little pockets of tourism, which could be more accurately reflected through policy area 2. So we've amended the plan as following. Yes.
And Bron, this is quite a significant change from the engagement draft rural strategy we put out. What's clear to me is the submissions we received on the rural strategy have added significant value to our assessment of the policy areas, revealed some areas that we needed to investigate more, resulting in this change in the policy area 2 pink area being what it is in the recommended report.
Yeah, absolutely, Ron. And that's a really valuable point. This is the first policy setting stage of which we effectively say, this is how we want to go forward. This is how we're setting the standards around how we see our quality agricultural land being protected and enhanced. The next stages will be that embedding those 2 policy areas, whether it be through scheme, overlays, zonings, whatever it may be. A number of you would have seen the reference to the rural activity zone, and we wanted to clarify it. So that's in the pinkish red colour, which is policy area 2. That is the future recommendation. We just want to be really clear that the word activity is not to encourage activity. It's just the actual title of the zone, where the focus is around agriculture and supporting ancillary type activities, which may be tourism, which may be viticulture, which may be, there's a number of supporting uses, which we will go into further as part of a second stage of work.
Absolutely. That's a really important point as well, Bron, in that this really sets the policy direction at a high level. And I've mentioned this in public meetings previously, that the adoption of our structure plans and rural strategy on September 3, should they be adopted, Do not change planning provisions applying to your property overnight. Bron mentioned that a significant process is required to actually implement and codify these proposed policy changes and controls and that sort of thing. And that in itself is a long process. It requires further extensive community and stakeholder consultation, and also future council resolutions throughout the process at key stages as well.
Absolutely.
Thank you, Bron, for going through those that overview. We do actually have some particular recommendations that you showed up before. Is there anything you wanted to highlight there?
Yes. If we just go back to slide, just to bring us back.
That's it.
So I think, Ron, the critical nature, it comes into two parts. We have the consideration of the change between the extent of policy area 2 to no longer cover areas such as Mount Franklin, Franklin Ford, Yandoit, Clydesdale, Strangeways, Guildford and Shepherd's Flat, to apply it over the Spring Hill area. And then the further work item that comes down to, and this is a co-recommendation as we touched on earlier from the traditional owners, JARA, as well, around those critical volcanic plains and critical areas that don't have expansive protection at the moment. So we want to pair this cultural assessment with a technical landscape-wide strategic landscape assessment that addresses land use, cultural biodiversity and aesthetic influences to inform the development and landscape protection measures. So I think they're probably the key takeaways from this work.
Perfect. And I do encourage our viewers to read the covering report, because many of the thematic areas in that report support the outcomes and findings of our rural strategy. So thank you, Bron, for that that summation of our rural strategy. Let's take our viewers now to Glenlyon and talk about our proposed structure plan for Glenlyon. So Glenlyon is the first township we've prepared a structure plan for. And in the public agenda, you'll find that there'll be a report specifically for Glenlyon with attachments. What we'll have attached is the original consultation draft of the Glenlyon structure plan. That's been added for your convenience, so you can view what officers originally recommended in a draft. But through the submission process, we've had a number of submissions that have really added value to the final recommended outcome of this structure plan. And one aspect is really just the identification of gaps and errors in the Glenlyon structure plan. And that's included as an attachment. And officers, through the submissions, have further investigated a number of issues and concluded a number of key recommendations for the township. And they're detailed in the officer's recommendation section of this report. So we'll take you through some of those key recommendations so you've got a better understanding. So Bron, one of the key recommendations is to do with a planning scheme control known as a development plan overlay. So that's a very specific control. And in order to enact it, we need to go through a planning scheme amendment process, as I've mentioned before. But we're recommending a development plan overlay to control built form outcomes, really, for an area at the south end of Glenlyon. Would you like to explain that a little bit more?
Absolutely, Ron. Thank you. I'll just share my screen so we can have a look at the image that we're referring to. Glenlyon is our most petite of all of the structure plans in size of the actual township. There's not an overly established commercial area. It's got a beautiful little general store, and then it has residential housing and meandering through town with a surrounding farming area. It's absolutely gorgeous. We have acknowledged and identified that Glenlyon is incredibly constrained from an environmental perspective. And because it's not sewered, it has wastewater treatment systems, which effectively do take up a fair amount of land when actually being appropriately installed and so on. So as a result, we've really had to cap the extent of development that can be considered in this little town. Where the development plan overlay comes in is the land in the south, as you've identified, is the last effective land that can be developed for the purpose of housing in this town, apart from an incremental block or two that's already identified in town. The development plan overlay is looking at things such as landscaping, the boundary, to ensure that the interface between farming land and residential is appropriate, to ensure that there's things like public reserves included, and to ensure that appropriate road connections is made so people can enter and exit the site in a really, fluid space. So that's the intention of the development plan overlay, and we believe it's going to have some really, really good outcomes if and when it eventually goes ahead.
And Bron, thank you for that. There are also some important natural features in Glenlyon that we have found worthy of protection by using a number of planning tools that are specific for that type of element. So controls such as the environmental significance overlay, vegetation protection overlays, and so on. So they've been highlighted as needed for the future. Can you explain a little bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely, Ron. So there is around the reserve and in the residential areas, there's a number of really important trees, tree-lined boulevards, both native and exotic. There is some area that's subject to inundation. So what we've done is we've recommended appropriate planning tools to be applied to help protect and enhance those areas. So, for example, an environmental sensitivity overlay would protect trees that perhaps could be removed under current provisions. Those really important network of tree-lined boulevards that we want to retain.
Thank you, Bron. And so these future recommended planning controls affect public land and also private properties. And
Absolutely.
It's important to remember for our viewers that that all requires a formal process in the future where private landowners will be consulted, engaged, and the views of public agencies will also be received with these proposed controls. Thank you, Bron. That wraps up Glenlyon. Let's jump to the western part of the Shire now, Bron, and how about we travel to Clunes? So Clunes, the Clunes Structure Plan report will have a similar format. We'll have an attachment that outlines corrections and updates. We'll have a map or a series of maps illustrating the recommended changes by officers, and we'll also attach for your convenience the original consultation draft so you can compare and contrast. Clunes, I recall at the public meeting, received quite a number of submissions raising concerns, but also supporting the work that we were doing. But one area of particular interest for our community, our Clunes community, was our proposed industrial area, Bron. And we have a recommendation here that really responds to the submissions and the further investigation that we conducted as a result of those submissions. So would you like to go through that?
Absolutely. Thanks, Ron. Yeah, no, Clunes was a fascinating example of how things evolve and change. So when looking at the industrial side of things, hopefully you can see I'm sharing my screen now.
Okay.
We've recommended actually pulling back and moving the proposed industry pocket to Ballarat Road away from homes. In the original proposal, there was a fair bit of interest around where we were proposing that industry, and that it may not be appropriate in line with some of the existing residential houses that were sitting there. So we did some further analysis and determined that perhaps on Ballarat Road, which is also a key freight road, could be a better option for a small pocket of industry to support that sort of surrounding rural community.
Thank you, Bron. And that that proposal recommended by officers will be subject to further investigation and community consultation, because it is a new element of our draft structure plan. And that will be conducted before we commence any planning scheme amendment process. The other key theme that came from Clunes was the sort of the viability, the economic viability of its commercial core. And we have an officer recommendation that seeks to really extend our commercial area, Bron.
Absolutely. So you'll see in the image that I still have on the screen, there's a red dot, a red square in the middle of town that adjoins the sort of yellow hazed area. That red spot or square is to investigate potential for some further commercial land to Bailey Street to enable new businesses to support the existing community and businesses that sit on Fraser. The challenge that we all have with Fraser is it's absolutely amazing, but it has been raised by a number of submissions and generally as challenging to commercially fit out a building that is highly constrained due to its heritage values has been something. So we wanted to identify some land with some potential that may have some further ease for commercial development.
And as part of our engagement process, we spoke to a number of public authorities, and in Clunes there are areas of Crown land here, and their sort of advice, and through those discussions, that's led to a number of recommendations that we have on Crown land. Would you like to speak to some of that?
Yeah, I think the biggest one, Ron, would absolutely be the returning all of Clunes Common from residential to farming zone. That was the major change in that space, and it's really responding to the nature of what that land is used for and going forward.
And consistent across all our townships and our rural Hepburn work is how we accommodate for population growth over the next 15, 20, 30 years. And each town really needs to carry a bit of weight to accommodate future population. And in Clunes, we've identified that area around 35 Paddock Street as having the best potential for accommodating future population growth and their housing needs. Our viewers will probably be aware that a recent planning application was decided by VCAT on 35 Paddock Street. We've earmarked part of that site for future higher density housing development. What does that all mean for our viewers?
Great question. This is the true planning side of things that we grapple with. So we did have an active application which was not consistent necessarily with what we strategically identified in the first version of the plans. So an active permit has been approved over Paddock Street. At the same time, when we were going through the strategic review of the structure plan with community submissions and so on, the community identified that Short Street and Sutherland Street, the residential land that had been identified in that space, wasn't appropriate necessarily either. And that came through in some of the authority submissions as well. So we are keeping a strong recommendation around 35 Paddock to have some further density there. When we say density, we're talking about the ability to accommodate housing and the numbers of housing within the areas. We're not looking at a metropolitan outcome. We're looking at still a larger footprint that's sympathetic to the area. But that can be a mix between those 2,000, 1,000 square metres sort of footprint sites. So if you have a look at the Clunes proposed map, you'll see in the top right-hand corner, you've got 35 Paddock Street with a number of red arrows going through and some dotted land. The dotted land sitting parallel to the school, that is identified as possibility for further residential intensification or density. And those roads, those red lines, they're actually looking at some proposed road networks that could be considered if that land was to be developed and intensified further.
Thank you very much. So they're really the key recommendations in the officer's recommendations section. There are a number of others. So what you'll find in the actual report in the public agenda will be an explanation of the basis behind each of our recommendations for each township and our rural strategy. Ron, thank you for that. Let's go next door to our largest township in Hepburnshire. Which one do you reckon that is? Yep, perfect. So Creswick, consistent with our other structure plan agenda reports, the Creswick structure plan report will contain an attachment outlining some updates and corrections that we need to make to the draft, updated maps reflecting the officer recommendation, and also the attached original draft that we went out to community consultation with. But Creswick is really the first township where we explicitly cover in our recommendation a former landfill and current active transfer station, and that exists within the Creswick township boundaries. So we received quite a number of submissions on how our structure plans depicted our former landfills and current active transfer stations. And we've received a number of submissions on our intended process to review possible planning scheme controls that better protect the neighbourhood around our transfer stations. And you may have read references to buffer area overlays and the like and so on. But through the submission process and our engagement with the EPA, we've modified our approach to our transfer stations in that it's important that we first investigate and get the facts of what actually is happening at our transfer stations from an environmental point of view. So council, separate to the structure plan process, has commenced its environmental investigation of our 4 transfer station sites. We're gathering data on any sort of emissions or contamination potential impacts that are emanating from those sites. And we're really in a fact-finding process. You'll find in our structure plans that we have recommended that council explicitly commits to completing the various analysis work that we've conducted, and then committing to reviewing the outcomes of that analysis, sharing it publicly so that everyone knows what our findings were. And that will inform really the next steps we take. Those next steps, depending on the findings, may result in no further work that's required from a planning point of view. So you'll find in the Creswick recommendation, there is a recommendation around the Creswick landfill, and that is a consistent approach our other townships with landfills as well.
Yeah, absolutely, Ron. I think, and they're really good points that you raise. Another one that adds to the complexity is that policy continues to change throughout the time while we're reviewing. So what's been really helpful is the EPA has recently released its latest buffer guidance, and that was in August 2024. So literally this month. So we will continue on the journey We'll continue, as you've said, going actually to the detailed investigations, and then we will review recommendations later as part of as this work continues. So it's a moving feast, but
Exactly.
we have listened to the community in this space, and we want to let the community know that we understand the sensitivities and the concerns in this space, and we're doing what we can to best reflect that.
That's right, Bron. And part of the continuation that you mentioned is that we need to continue to identify these sites in our structure plans. And the reason for that is our statutory planning decisions are required to take into account existing planning provisions in our planning scheme, and they're to do with incompatible uses. So there's a consideration around that for development around our transfer stations. And our statutory planners also need to consider particular provisions in our planning scheme related to sites such as this and others which nominate a buffer area. So that is applied today regardless of whether we have structure plans or not, and it's important that we continue to identify these sites in one way or another. But you'll find in our recommendation and the attached plans for our townships that the way we're identifying these sites is different compared to the original engagement draft.
Absolutely. So that orange blur that you were all referring to is now just a star at the moment with some possible future investigations around the wording. So as Ron has identified, so we thank you for your feedback there, and hopefully that clarifies the first point of work going forward in this space.
Great. Bron, but there is more to Creswick than just a former landfill. So
absolutely, the jewel of the West.
That's right. Our recommendation also speaks about a number of other matters, and I'm just scanning through our recommendation to see what stands out here.
Look, I'll share the.
How about we do that?
The plan, and we'll have a look at it and see what.
Great.
There weren't too huge. Creswick has been a very engaged and open community, but there wasn't a huge amount of concerns raised with the structure plan, Ron. So some of the key changes, as we identified, was around the investigation area and what that looks like in all of our structure planning areas. We also identified a couple of other key things, which was one of the most challenging spaces in Creswick is actually around the existing waste transfer site, currently zoned industrial. We're actually recommending to remove the undeveloped part of industrial zoning on the ring road, and looking at rezoning the adjoining Crown land known as Creswick Common for public purposes. We're also looking at the transfer station as going back to public purposes of public use as well. And that's just to really reflect what the land is used for at the moment. We are also looking at rezoning 1 Ann Street from general residential to local industrial commercial use to be better fit with the existing residential interface in that area.
Thank you, Bron. That nicely sums up our recommendations around Creswick.
Beautiful. Thanking you.
Let's move to the eastern part of our shire now. And let's go through our recommendations for Daylesford Hepburn Springs. So the Daylesford Hepburn Springs Structure Plan report is similar in format to the other townships work we've covered already. There'll be an attachment detailing updates and corrections, an attachment illustrating the officer recommended changes, and also we will attach the original engagement draft of the Daylesford Hepburn Springs Structure Plan, and that'll enable our community to better compare and contrast the changes to what was originally put out there. Now, there are some significant changes which we'll cover in a moment, but there are many other smaller scale changes that are all detailed in the report, and an explanation as to the basis behind those changes will be included in the report. Bron, would you like to cover some of the bigger changes we're recommending?
Absolutely. Thanks, Ron. Well, first and foremost, I think it would be appropriate of us to thank the numerous submitters that did make submissions in this space, and we did at the beginning of this presentation as well. But the reason I'm highlighting this is that we as planners take core considerations out of the submissions you're making, so things like environmental impact, needs for land, demand, supply, core view impacts into our town entries and so on as part of our considerations. So when reviewing the various submissions that were made in relation to Daylesford, we've raised a number of key these have raised a number of key considerations which we've used to inform some of the recommended amendments as part of this process. There's three main considerations that we've looked at, and that comes down to our commercial land, our residential greenfield recommendation, and industrial land. The main, so one of the key first recommendations is at 43 East Street, Daylesford, delete potential for new residential area, and that means remove the recommended proposal to rezone that farming zone at land to industrial and residential. So we're saying that's going to be omitted from the plan in its entirety. The recommendation is to then include 26 Knox Street and part of 4738 Midland Highway, which abuts the residential area on the corner at the moment, as potential new residential area, with demonstrating areas that are more visually intrusive to be dedicated as possible open space requirements. The industrial land would be recommended to be extracted from the proposal, moved from 26 Knox Street and moved to the established industrial site of the old abattoir on Leeches Creek Road. The final would be, one of the final considerations is commercial land along Main Street in Hepburn. There, at the moment, majority of the land is zoned residential. Our recommendation is to change a number of those, or extend the commercial zoning and change a number of those residential zones to commercial to reflect the appropriate use of the land that is currently being used on sites such as Bellinzona, Peppers, and extending, and not just having pockets, but actually having a clear main street, as the name implies. Thanks, Ron.
And that's justified by the SGS land capacity and demand analysis for additional commercial land and support over the next 15, 20, 30 years.
Absolutely.
The change you highlighted initially, Ron, in terms of deleting our designation of 43 East Street, also covers the industrial designation we had for that site or adjacent to that site. So that's all being recommended to be explored at Leeches Road. So these changes, Bron, they are new to the structure plan. They weren't included in the draft. So the officer recommendation includes an additional process of community consultation and further investigation for these new elements prior to any commencement of a planning scheme amendment.
Absolutely. I might jump in, Ron, just while you're speaking to it, and actually we can show the plan around some of our proposed considerations in this space.
Yeah, and it would be good for our viewers to see where we've earmarked the potential open space area for that new area of focus is.
Absolutely. So can you see that plan there in front of, yep, in the full screen?
Yes.
So I'm just hovering the mouse over the area that's identified, so we can see We can see below here the original East Street proposal has been removed from the plan. The township boundary has been amended to reflect that this hatched or strike through blue option is the new proposed residential expansion area nestled within the township boundary or the proposed amended township boundary. Behind it, there's an existing low density residential area that's already developed on. We're recommending it is currently zoned farming zone. We're saying it could be rezoned to low density residential to allow for the actual realised use of that site. And then here, yes, as mentioned above, we have extracted out the industry from 26 knocks and also the proposed that was to be part of 43, and recommending, we can't actually see it on this plan, but further up the road, which is sitting on Leach's Creek, the existing abattoir site to be developed for a industry purpose.
Thank you, Bron. And another significant change in response to submissions is to do with the former landfill at Daylesford, which is now an active transfer station. So a similar approach to Creswick has been applied here in that we've changed how we've identified that property, but also more significantly, we've changed how we're approaching that property. So our viewers will recall that the original consultation draft contained an implication that we'd potentially explore a buffer area overlay planning scheme control. So we're taking that back to basics and really just obtaining the facts and the data for that site and our three other former landfill sites to ascertain exactly what the site conditions are and the potential risks emanating from that site. Council has commenced that environmental analysis for all our former landfills, and an officer recommendation in the covering report and in this report spells out a commitment to complete that analysis and to make the results publicly available, and then to consider what the next steps may be. So they could be anything from do nothing to the exploration of appropriate planning provisions. But at this stage, obtaining the facts is the most important element of all of that. Now, the reason, Bron, we need to continue to identify our 4 former landfill sites on our plans is because there are current planning scheme provisions that require our statutory planners to consider these sites. And Absolutely. It's important that we continue to identify them. And these current provisions in our planning scheme are to do with state policy on incompatible uses, and also a particular provision in the planning scheme that talks about sites such as this with potential offsite impacts and sort of a consideration of a buffer area around them. So that language is already in the site. But just to reiterate, we're taking it back to basics and obtaining the facts at this point. If anything were to be proposed in the future, it would involve future community consultation, stakeholder consultation with the EPA, and so on. So that's the other significant change to these maps, Bron.
Absolutely. Thanks.
Is there anything else you wanted to highlight with Daylesford Hepburn Springs? I think we've covered it all. How about we move on to Trentham?
Absolutely. Thanks, Ron.
Thank you, Bron. So the final structure plan report officers are presenting is the Trentham structure plan. Now, Trentham also received significant community interest, and I do thank all submitters for their efforts in providing us information. We also had significant state agency involvement in Trentham as well, particularly the CFA and the EPA. And that speaks to Trentham's context surrounded by forest and the need to acknowledge and consider strongly bushfire risk, but also EPA in terms of the major hazard facility that exists in Trentham, which is quite an unusual arrangement compared to our other townships. So thank you all that participated in our process. Bron, would you like to show us the Trentham map and run through the broad changes? Whilst Bron's bringing that up, there are quite a number of other officer recommended changes in Trentham that are detailed in the report, and an explanation will be provided in the report as to the basis behind those recommendations as well. Thanks, Bron.
Thanks, Ron. Good to see you again. The detail that came through on the Trentham submissions was phenomenal. So thank you very much. And what it really did was able to provide us with some really strong clarity around the recommendations that we've made to change some of these amendments in the plans. So originally, as most of you would probably remember, the southwest expansion of the township was actually proposed to be quite significantly larger than what we have proposed in the attached plan. One of the interesting complexities with Trentham is that there is a large expanse of low density residential land, and that is currently zoned for the purpose of low density residential. So sites such as this land that I'm hovering over at the moment, that's on Blue Mount Road, that site, even though it currently appears as farming land, is actually low density residential. And that's similar up here at the top near Tresida Court. So as part of the review process that we undertook in conjunction with the submissions, we really had to have a look at how we can supply appropriate or provide an appropriate projected supply of land within Trentham, whilst also achieving some really good outcomes and improved outcomes for the community. Things such as connecting road networks, things such as the dedication or designation of some fantastic reserve public open space, connection across perhaps the likes of South Street to the other side of town, and really looking at some more density around our town core that's so lovely and established. Trentham does have a very established character, and that's around your landscaped blocks, and it does have, so we've tried to continue that in recommendations going forward. So any development that does go ahead into the future will actually have some of that nestled in, those considerations nestled into it. So when planners are making recommendations and decisions, they can actually really inform that with some of this work. So there's so in a nutshell, there's two key recommended residential areas for intensification. The first sits in the southwest around Blue Mount Road, and that's around this portion of land here. And then the second sits up the top on Falls Road, across from the Trentham Golf Course. Both of those sites have been earmarked with potential for further residential development. As we sort of touched on before, currently they're low density residential. We're recommending consideration for neighbourhood residential in the future, and that sits around that sort of 1,000 to 2,000 square metre footprint lot. We do not have that specified on the plans at the moment. It's more around the considered approach going forward when we do that next phase of work.
And that's an important point, Bron. So the southwest corner was earmarked in the engagement draft for the majority of that precinct to designated as a higher density zone, the neighbourhood residential zone. But in response to submissions and the EPA input, a more sort of balanced approach, a more reasonable approach, is to significantly shrink that designation to what we have now on the plan, which officers will recommend.
Absolutely. Thanks, Ron. The other visual that you will notice that has changed is around our major hazard facility and how it is visually marcated on the plans. So it is different to our waste transfer stations because this is an established use that has managed requirements as to how it's a licensed facility. So this is why it is now visualised differently to the other sites. And then you can see the Trentham transfer station down the bottom, which is just now marked by a star. So there are a few a few tweaks in here. There is a more detailed schedule on some of those other considerations, but those key major changes and responses to the submissions here in front of you. I don't know if you have any other sort of comments or questions to ask, Ron, that I can elaborate on at all.
Did you touch on the potential for the property on Bluemount Road to incorporate a significant open space link alongside the creek?
Yeah, very good point. I probably just grazed over it slightly. So on this site here that runs along that beautiful creek, there is the recommendation, should that be developed, that a significant portion of it, or a percentage of it, is included as part of public reserve, and around activating that reserve so people can continue walking along that critical creekway and enjoy that space as a public space.
Perfect. Thank you, Bron. And I think you've covered it all, actually, so thank you for that. As I said, more details can be found in the officer's report. But that wraps up all our township structure plans and the rural strategy. So thank you for going through all that, Bron, with us. Really, the next steps are that we present this package of reports and recommendations to Council for a decision on September 3. And should this package be adopted, I think it's important for us to go through the process from there. So, Bron, I see you've put up a slide already. Thank you. Would you like to speak to that?
Sure, absolutely. So as Ron's touched on, step one is the strategy, local level direction setting. That's the space we're in at the moment, and we're hoping that Council will make a decision on the 3rd of September on all of the 5 township structure plans and rural strategy, which makes part of an overarching settlement strategy. Ultimately, then, the amendment documents would be prepared up, and we would put to the Minister to authorise. There would be, and the authorisation process would be to go out for further public consultation and panel consideration. So the next step is planning scheme amendments. So that's changing the zones, the overlays, the policy in response to enable that direction. Then the third stage is planning permits and implementing the direction. So we're looking at effectively a 5-year process, 3 from here, and in totality around 5 years to get this stuff implemented, this work implemented into the planning scheme and actioned. So we appreciate your absolute commitment in this space. We are committed to this process, and we want to make sure that you do have opportunity going forward, and there are at least on the 2 stages of which you can absolutely speak to your submissions and to the proposals.
Thank you, Bron. And the point that you're making comes through strongly, that the completion of this stage of Future Hepburn is really just the first step in a long 3-step process. Step 2 is quite a significant one, and its success will really depend on future council decisions that are informed by community and stakeholder input, but also that's the stage which I've spoken before at public meetings, where the Minister for Planning has significant say in whether council can proceed in the process or not, and informing the Minister will be the likes of an independent panel of experts that the Minister appoints to review council's strategic work, critique it, and ultimately recommend to the Minister their views. So, Bron, I think we'll be seeing much more of, should this be adopted on September 3, it will pave the way for us seeing much more of our community and stakeholders into the future.
And I think, and just reiterating that point of yours, Ron, because it is very valid, an independent panel. We appreciate, the state appreciates that there is a huge wealth of knowledge and work that goes into this space that needs an independent review as well to make sure that we have got it right. So we are the first stage of many, and we are the localised representation And we is the collective community council and officers trying to the technical recommendations. But there are further stages, absolutely. And we look forward to working with you all on this process going forward.
Thank you. So that wraps up our session. Thank you for joining us. I hope it's been beneficial and helped you understand what this package of information really is attempting to achieve. So we look forward to next week, September 3, for the special council meeting. Thank you, Bron.